Well, hello and welcome everyone to our webinar on building a safety-first culture, tips for businesses. I'm really glad you could join us today. My name is Dickson Wu and I'm a senior lawyer in LegalVision's Employment and Work Health and Safety team. And I'm joined by my colleague, Eleanor Kenny, who is a lawyer in the team. Now, before we begin, just a few really quick housekeeping items just to make you aware of. Firstly is you'll receive a copy of the recording as well as the slides in your email after the webinar. Secondly, we do have a dedicated time of question and answer at the very end of the session. And so please feel free to submit any questions you have on the topics that we raised today. And we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the session. We've also received some pre-submitted questions from when you registered for the webinar. And so we'll try to get to as many of those as well. And finally, we do have a feedback survey, which we kindly ask you to complete at the end of the webinar. We really want to make these webinars as useful for you as possible. And one way to help us to do that is to get your feedback on things that you liked and things that we can do better as well. So it'll only take you 30 seconds to a minute at the end of the webinar. We'd really appreciate it if you could fill it out. The other thing I wanted to note is that for the next 48 hours, you'll be eligible for a free consultation with LegalVision. And that's just to discuss how we can best help your business in relation to safety matters or other legal issues that your business may be facing. If you are interested in this consultation, please provide your contact details in that survey that I mentioned at the end of the webinar. All right, so today we're going to be addressing quite a few topics in relation to building a safety culture. And so specifically, we're going to run through an overview of your WHS obligations. We'll define what is a safety culture, and then we'll look at some of the key characteristics of a safety-first culture, including the role of leadership, training and involving workers, developing and implementing safety policies, as well as monitoring, reporting, and continuous improvement. And as I mentioned, we'll have some time at the end to answer your questions. So just to set the scene for what we're going to be discussing today, you'll see that we're going to note that it's important to be proactive and regular in considering WHS matters. It's actually especially relevant to address these topics today because October is National Safe Work Month. And that's a time when all individuals and organizations are encouraged to prioritize WHS and to promote a positive safety culture. And so part of our goal today is really to provide you with some really practical tips that you can consider implementing in your organization. So with all that said, I'll hand it over to Ellie to kick us off with an overview of WHS obligations.
Thanks so much, Dickson. So as Dickson indicated, we will start by giving you an overview of the legislative framework for WHS throughout Australia. In 2011, Safe Work Australia developed model WHS laws to provide a balanced and consistent framework across Australia that ensures the health and safety of workers and workplaces. All Australian states and territories have implemented the model WHS laws, except for Victoria. Victoria has instead maintained their own legislation, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. WHS obligations in Victoria are broadly the same as those conflated by the model WHS laws, with a primary difference being the language used to describe certain duty holders under the Act and the obligations for senior employees of the business. So we note that if you are based in Victoria, today's presentation will still be very much relevant and helpful to your business, given the similarities between the relevant laws. So when considering your business's obligations under WHS laws, it is essential to first understand which parties are considered duty holders. Namely, the WHS laws impose duties on persons conducting a business or undertaking, which is commonly shortened to PCBU, and that basically just means the business itself. We then have officers, meaning your senior and executive staff, and finally we have workers. So we'll now move on to the actual obligations of each of those duty holders. Starting with PCBUs. So a PCBU covers any kind of business and includes sole traders, companies, partnerships, and unincorporated bodies or associations. WHS laws provide that a PCBU has the primary duty of care to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers and others in the workplace. Generally speaking, this obligation includes the provision and maintenance of a safe workplace, including having safe equipment, structures, and systems of work, the safe use, handling, and storage of plants, structures, and substances, the provision of adequate and accessible facilities for the welfare of workers, the provision of information, training, instruction, and supervision of your employees and officers, and finally, continuous monitoring of the conditions in the workplace, as well as the health of workers. A PCBU's duty to do what is reasonably practicable will be assessed based on the specific circumstances at hand. This means that a small business would be expected to take very different steps than a large corporation when ensuring the working environment is safe. Notably, several factors are relevant in determining what is reasonably practicable in each set of circumstances, including the likelihood of the hazard or risk actually occurring in the workplace, the degree of harm that might result from the hazard or risk, knowledge about the hazard or risk and ways of managing it, the availability and suitability of options to eliminate or otherwise minimize the risk, and the cost associated with the available options for actually managing the risk. It is clear from these factors that assessing risk within the workplace and putting in place appropriate control measures is not an exact science, and each risk really should be considered in the context of the specific circumstances. So we'll now move on to officers. Officers are defined in the model WHS laws as those people within the business who make decisions that have an impact on the whole or a substantial part of a business, such as your senior managers and C-suite executives. Under WHS laws, officers have an obligation to exercise due diligence to ensure that the PCBU complies with its WHS duties. Officers can assist the PCBU in meeting its obligations by taking reasonable steps to acquire and keep their WHS knowledge up to date. So in order to ensure that the business is compliant, officers must first have an understanding of the actual WHS framework. They should understand the hazards and risks associated with the specific business at play. They should ensure that suitable resources and processes are in place and being used to manage WHS risks, including having appropriate policies and guides in place. And they should ensure that appropriate reporting processes are in place and followed for WHS incidents, hazards, and risks that are identified from time to time. So finally, we have workers, who also have obligations with respect to WHS. Workers are defined as people who carry out work in any capacity for a PCBU. This includes employees, contractors, apprentices, trainees, and volunteers. WHS laws require workers to take reasonable care for their own health and safety, take reasonable care for the health and safety of others who may well be impacted by their actions or omissions in the workplace. They must comply with reasonable instructions given by the PCBU and cooperate with any reasonable WHS policies or procedures that the PCBU has notified them of. You will note that while the business itself does hold the primary duty of care for ensuring safety in the workplace, all members of an organisation will still have obligations with respect to WHS. Each state and territory in Australia has a local workplace health and safety body that regulates and enforces compliance with WHS laws. These bodies can investigate WHS complaints, issue monetary penalties, or prosecute through the courts for breaches of work health and safety duties. They also appoint inspectors who can visit workplaces to provide information and advice about work health and safety requirements and monitor compliance with laws. Therefore, if a duty holder is found to have breached their obligations under WHS laws, they may be subject to financial penalties as well as imprisonment, depending on the severity of the resulting injury and the nature of the actual breach at hand. An example to illustrate how the severity of a duty holder's behaviour may impact penalties is the case of WGA Proprietary Limited. WGA is a window glass company in New South Wales that was fined $1 million in 2017 for contravening WHS laws. In this case, a contractor of WGA was working on a window ledge at a residential apartment construction site. He subsequently sustained an electric shock from nearby power lines and suffered burns to 30% of his body. Before the incident, a Safe Work New South Wales inspector and Sydney Trains had provided advice to WGA about working around the power lines. However, WGA did not follow the advice or take the necessary steps to protect the worker. Thus, they were subject to quite hefty fines. So now that we have an understanding of the general WHS legislative framework, let's turn to the importance of building a safety-first culture and what that might practically look like for your business. A safety-first culture is an organizational mindset and practice that places the highest priority on the safety and well-being of employees and any other workers, customers, and the community. This kind of culture is generally characterized by a few different concepts that Dickson will discuss in more detail in a moment. In short, they include a commitment from leadership. This looks like top management consistently demonstrating a commitment to safety through their actions, decisions, resource allocation, and proactive compliance with relevant WHS obligations. We also want to see employee involvement. This is where employees at all levels of the business are engaged in safety initiatives, encouraged to report hazards, and are empowered to suggest improvements. Continuous improvement is also essential. This means that the organization continuously assesses and improves its safety processes and systems, learning from incidents and near misses as well. We would like to see clear communication of safety policies, procedures, and expectations throughout the organization to ensure that they are broadly understood. And finally, training and education are incredibly important. Regular training ensures that employees have the knowledge and skills to perform their work safely. It allows employees to better understand the reporting mechanisms in place, the expectations from the business, and how they can generally assist in creating a safer working environment. So beyond ensuring that the business is generally compliant with its obligations in accordance with applicable legislation, creating a safety-first culture can also lead to benefits such as fewer workplace accidents, injuries, and illnesses. This not only protects employees, but also reduces the direct and indirect costs associated with accidents, such as potential penalties, legal costs, and even workers' compensation premiums. You might also see increased engagement and retention. A positive safety culture fosters a supportive work environment, leading to higher employee engagement and retention. Workers are generally much more likely to stay with an organization that demonstrates genuine concern for their safety. You may also see better quality of work. Employees who feel safe and valued are much more likely to be motivated and focused, resulting in higher quality work and better overall performance. So in summary, fostering a safety-first culture is not only a moral and ethical obligation, but also a strategic business decision. It enhances the well-being of employees, leads to operational efficiencies, and strengthens the organization's reputation, ultimately contributing to long-term success. So I'll then now hand over to Dickson to discuss some of the key characteristics of a safety-first culture.
Thanks so much, Ellie. So really important now that we've got a bit of that framework around the duty holders, the legal obligations under WHS laws, as well as understanding what an actual safety culture is. One thing I just wanted to re-emphasize is that in terms of these characteristics of a safety-first culture that we'll be addressing now, really important to remember that you should consider them in the context of that legal obligation we discussed around taking reasonable steps to ensure the health and safety of your workers. So in other words, you may not be able to reasonably implement every single tip or recommendation that we provide today. And that's okay. We're giving you as much as possible for you to consider, and we hope that will be helpful. But you should consider them in the context of your own organization and what's reasonable in the circumstances, say, considering the size and the nature of your organization. So as Ellie mentioned, the first characteristic of a safety-first culture that we're going to consider is commitment from leadership. Now, leaders can exist at all levels of an organization, whether someone is a senior executive, a middle-level manager, a team leader, or simply just a more experienced team member. And leaders can influence the attitudes and behaviors of others. This can be through formal roles as well as personal influence. leaders who demonstrate poor behavior are likely to contribute to poor organizational culture, as well as risks to health and safety. So, for example, if managers provide insufficient support or recognition to workers, or if they engage in harmful behaviors such as bullying or harassment. Conversely, if workers know their leaders place high importance on WHS, it just becomes part of everyday work and they become more likely to follow safety procedures, as well as to raise safety issues as they arise, making health and safety part of culture. Now, Safe Work Australia has set out 5 principles for leading a workplace that promotes safety. I'll run through these fairly quickly. The first one is to simply commit to safety. Secondly is for leaders to get involved. So, for example, a good leader can promote work health and safety through leading and influencing WHS discussions, helping people understand the risks of injuries and illnesses, as well as making people confident that workplace risks can be managed and are taken seriously. The next principle is around encouraging participation through talking to workers and involving them in WHS, and we'll discuss this a bit further a little bit later. Fourthly, it's to make WHS part of your business and a key part of it, part of discussions, part of board meetings, leadership meetings, making sure that as reasonably practicable, it is an important and part of your business and you're proactively addressing it. And finally would be to continually review your performance in relation to WHS. Ultimately, good leadership helps workers know and comply with WHS laws. So, for example, coming back to the officer's duty to exercise due diligence, that duty itself has elements of good leadership, such as having knowledge about WHS matters, having resources to manage WHS risks, as well as monitoring and evaluating those risks. We'll now consider another characteristic of a safety-first culture, which is to involve and train your workers. So again, coming back to Safe Work Australia's recommendations, they have got 3 basic steps that they recommend to help ensure that workers are appropriately trained and supported. The first step is to provide induction and WHS training for new workers. So before any new worker commences work with you, you should train them to help them become familiar with their tasks, their place of work, and the people working around them. And this will help them to understand how to do their work safely and lets them know that you take safety seriously as well. Some induction topics that you can consider addressing would be the workers' responsibilities regarding health and safety, what hazards and risks are in the workplace and how to control them. It could address safe work procedures and how to use equipment safely, as well as how to raise a WHS issue if it arises, emergency procedures such as how to evacuate, the assembly points, exit locations, and fire wardens, or even just where to find the first aid kit. You should give workers contact details for people with health and safety responsibilities in your workplace. This could include your first aid officers and any return to work coordinators. You can also let workers know about any employee assistance programs, or EAPs, that your workplace may offer, as well as how they can access them. It's important you make sure every new worker demonstrates that they understand the training. And one way that can help you to achieve this is by having and using a checklist to make the induction easier and to help ensure that you've covered everything you need to. So with that checklist, you can just work through that with your worker, tick it off, and then get them to sign at the end of that, which you can then keep on file as a record of employee training. The next step that's recommended is to train workers for their specific tasks. So now that you've inducted them on day 1 or in their first week, you then want to ensure that they've got adequate training for the specific work that they're performing. So your workers should have supervised hands-on training as much as can in the tasks they'll perform before they start a job. So you can train your workers to perform tasks safely, to operate machines and equipment safely, to use and maintain any personal protective equipment, as well as to follow safe work procedures. It's also important to be considering training your workers on non-physical risks to health and safety as well, what we could also call psychosocial hazards, which we're seeing to be more and more prominent in terms of claims and prosecutions in relation to WHS. So for example, you could provide training to help your workers understand what workplace bullying, discrimination, and harassment is, why that behavior is prohibited. It could also involve training on fatigue management, on working in isolated environments as well. Once you provide the training, you also want to just check that each worker can demonstrate that they can follow the safe work procedures and perform their work tasks safely with and without supervision. So the idea here is, of course, you want to give them the training that you need, but also consider observing just to make sure that that training has sunk in and that they understand everything and that they're performing their job safely as well. Now, one quick thing to note is that if your organization is involved in certain activities, normally regulated activities like construction, handling of chemicals, or heavy machinery operation, just may need to seek some further guidance on legislative training requirements from your WHS regulator. The third step is to provide ongoing training and supervision. So you've inducted them, you've provided them some initial training on how to do their job safely. Then it's about what ongoing training and supervision can you provide to make sure they maintain the working safely procedures and processes that have been set out. So what you really want to do is follow up. Make sure you observe your workers to check that they're still following the safe work procedures. You can conduct informal discussions or toolbox talks with them to talk about specific health and safety issues. And you can be encouraging workers to provide feedback. That can be through surveys, which can be anonymous as well, as a way for workers to be able to give their feedback and raise any issues on their end as well. Now, young and newer workers generally will need closer and more regular supervision than experienced workers. And you should also consider the requirements of those who may have disabilities, cultural differences, or if English is not their first language. You should regularly assess the effectiveness of your training and supervision processes and adjust them as necessary. So for example, if you provide training on bullying and discrimination, and if there are changes in the law in relation to those areas, it's useful to just check that the material, the content of what you're presenting and training on is up to date as well. You can also be monitoring workplace incidents and consulting your workers, which will help you identify areas for improvement and ensure your training remains effective and relevant. Finally, it's really good practice to maintain records for all training so you know who has been trained, how they performed, and what further training may be required. Part of this, as I mentioned earlier, is to keep a record of the worker's induction, as well as any supervision and spot checks. Record keeping is really important and really useful. Say in a situation where there is an incident that occurs, there might be, say, a breach of safety and safety requirements by a worker. If you've done the wrong thing here and they come back to you and say, well, I was never told that I couldn't do this. If you actually had a record that you trained them on it, which they've signed off on, then it goes a long way to you being able to say, yeah, you've taken the step here of training them on that particular issue, on how to use a piece of equipment safely or to not bully, discriminate, or harass others in the workplace. Just want to quickly touch on consultation as a way of involving workers in WHS matters. And so a PCBU actually has a legal duty to consult, again, so far as is reasonably practicable, with workers of a business who are or are likely to be directly affected by a health and safety matter. So really important that in all of this, that you're considering how you're consulting with workers as well. Moving on to another characteristic, promoting a safety-first culture also involves developing and implementing safety policies. To zoom out very quickly here and thinking about workplace policies more generally, what are they? They're simply written directions from employers to employees. And so as an employer, you have a right to make what we call lawful and reasonable directions to employees. And policies are one way to capture these directions. It's a way to effectively communicate them, and they can set out how you want your business to run. what behaviors you expect from team members. So you should develop and implement safety policies which make it clear the workers' obligations in relation to safety. So one example here is a work health and safety policy, and that's a reasonable step that all employers can take to help meet their WHS obligations. That policy should broadly outline the obligations of the business, of managers, and of workers in relation to WHS, as well as establish consultation processes. Another policy that we recommend all employers to have is an anti-discrimination, harassment, and bullying policy. What that policy does is effectively prohibit discrimination, harassment, and bullying in the workplace and outline what the conduct is, what it looks like in practice, and how it can be avoided in the workplace. Now, depending on the nature of the work, you may also have other, maybe more bespoke safety policies. So for example, you can have policies about emergency procedures and communication systems, policies around working from home, fatigue management, hazardous manual handling, and personal protective equipment. I'll now just provide some practical tips for developing and implementing safety policies that you can keep in mind. The first being that the policies should be explicit and define key terms used throughout the policy so that workers understand what is meant by the terms. So for example, in an anti-bullying policy, you should define what bullying is. You can give examples as well. Next, the policy should also explain what is acceptable and what is unacceptable behaviour in the workplace. And you may wish to include specific examples to illustrate problem areas or unacceptable types of behaviours. Next, practical tip is to just be really clear about who the policy applies to. So for example, does it only apply to employees of your organisation, or does it extend to contractors or subcontractors engaged to perform work on business premises? Policies should be written in plain English and easily understood by all workers. They should also include a term which states that a breach of the policy may result in disciplinary action up to and including termination of employment or the engagement. Employers should also ensure that their workers have read and understood the directions of the policy. And I'll give some strategies and ideas for how you can implement and get their confirmation that they've read and understood the policies. So firstly, if you have a HR software or an intranet where all of your policies are contained, it's really useful to have your workers acknowledge that they've read, understood, and will comply with the policy. But even if you don't have a formal system or intranet portal for that, it could just be by return email. It's just really good to have something in writing there. Next up, you can create mandatory e-learning modules on the content of the policies. You can conduct training sessions and seminars on practical implementation of the policy. And you can keep copies of policies where they're easily accessible in folders, policy manuals, or an intranet system. Finally, employers should review, revise, and recirculate the policy regularly. Best practice would be to review a policy annually, and you could even keep a note on when the policy was last updated. So with all of those tips in mind, I'll now hand it back to Ellie to address monitoring, reporting, and continuous improvement.
Thanks so much, Dickson. So after all that, it's clear that there is a positive obligation for businesses to take proactive steps to ensure the health and safety of workers. One of the core tenets of this concept is to ensure that the business is continuously monitoring its operations, identifying and assessing risks as they arise, and taking the reasonably practicable steps to eliminate or otherwise reduce those risks. Ensuring your business commits to the ongoing monitoring and reporting of risks and making the necessary improvements is the only method to ensure compliance with the business's obligations. Beyond responding to any complaints or reports raised by workers or officers, the business should be proactively monitoring its operations in an effort to identify any risks or hazards within the workplace. Regular safety audits and inspections should be carried out by a senior worker within the organisation or an external contractor who specialises in workplace health and safety. These audits should involve a full review of the business's policies, procedures, and any other documents the business has in place with regard to workplace health and safety, as well as an inspection of the physical workplace and any plant or equipment. So this is going to be particularly important where workers are performing physical labor or if they're operating heavy machinery. So a representative from the business should also take steps to actively consult with workers throughout the inspection or audit process. As Dickson said, this essentially allows workers to proactively report any concerns they have regarding health and safety in the workplace. The inspections and audits alone will show that the business is taking reasonably practicable steps to reduce risks to health and safety and should allow the business to reduce the number of workplace injuries that occur. However, businesses should also ensure that appropriate action is taken to address any risks identified throughout the audit process. Further, a transparent and clear reporting system is essential for maintaining an open and proactive safety culture. Firstly, any mechanism to make a report or complaint with regard to work health and safety should be clearly articulated in the business's work health and safety policy to ensure that any issues are being actively reported in a timely manner. Employees should also be made to feel comfortable to make such a report and understand that there will be no negative implications for doing so. Achieving a safety-first culture by implementing the tips Dickson discussed earlier should result in a workplace culture that encourages such reports to be made without the fear of victimization. These reports will allow the business to act swiftly on any risks within the workplace that may have arisen following the most recent audit or inspection and assist in the prevention of any workplace injuries. They may also allow the business to analyze any trends that exist with regard to the types of risks that are occurring within the business and how it can then take proactive steps to eliminate these risks prior to complaints or reports being made. Feedback from safety audits, inspections, and reporting systems is invaluable for continuous improvement. It helps organizations identify weaknesses, implement corrective actions, and enhance their safety management systems. It is essential that businesses not only identify risks within the workplace, but then actually take the active steps necessary to reduce or eliminate these risks. Namely, a result of these audits, inspections, or reports may be developing immediate corrective actions to address active safety issues, updating WHS policies to provide further guidance on WHS issues, implementing feedback into training programs for employees and officers, or otherwise implementing new WHS documents entirely, such as guides or manuals regarding the use of certain equipment. So that concludes the main part of our webinar today. We note that you might find our publication, Safety Essentials for SMEs, helpful, which you can download in the Resources tab, or otherwise you can scan the QR code that's currently presented on the slides for you. You might also be interested in our upcoming event on Thursday, the 21st of November, which will address navigating wage compliance and strategies for protecting your business and your employees. So we're going to answer your questions shortly, but we'll give you a moment just to submit them. And we'll take a minute to tell you a little bit about LegalVision's membership. So by becoming a member at LegalVision, your business gets unlimited access to our full team of 100+ specialist lawyers for all of your business as usual legal needs. Our team can assist you with unlimited document drafting and reviewing of business contracts, unlimited legal advice consultations, unlimited domestic trademark registrations, and much more. We also offer a dedicated service for in-house teams and general counsel to manage your high-volume business as usual legal tasks. Our lawyers invest upfront in understanding what's important to your business and essentially work as an extension of your in-house legal function. So to learn more about how membership or desk extension can help you, you can request a free consultation when the survey appears at the end of this webinar. So we'll start by answering some of your questions. So we have a question here that starts with, we work in the healthcare space. carers engage in hazardous manual handling tasks every day. Is manual handling training a compulsory education module? Often training is poor. And what is Safe Work Australia's position on this, considering the number of claims that occur in this space?
Yeah, really good question. And I guess a specific one to your industry and to your organization. I'm not aware that manual handling training is a compulsory one as such under the law. It's not something I've had to look in specifically as yet, but from what I understand, a lot of the compulsory one under the model WHS laws and regulations are around use of heavy equipment, handling hazardous chemicals and things like that. In saying that, I am aware there is a lot of guidance. There is a model code of practice around hazardous manual handling as well. And a code of practice is effectively a document published by Safe Work where they provide recommendations on how to assess risk and how to mitigate and eliminate risk in relation to certain areas. And I'm aware hazardous manual handling is one of those. And so as a starting point, if you haven't already, I'd suggest looking at that particular resource, that code of practice, because that's going to provide you with some really helpful tips for the type of training and information that you can provide to your workers. Of course, it's going to be very context heavy, the particular type of manual handling that's involved as well, and the nature and size of your business as well. But I would say, hopefully, if that helps, start there. And that helps you understand what Safe Work's position and recommendations are as well in this space. And then you might consider formal training, formal policies around this as well. So yeah, I'd start there. And then I know part of this question mentions NDIS as well. I'm not an NDIS expert, but we have colleagues here at LegalVision who are. But from my experience, I've seen that in the NDIS space, there's some, maybe some other requirements or other considerations there as well. So yeah, just to consider this holistically is what I would say. But if you haven't already, start with the Safe Work Code of Practice on hazardous manual handling. And if you can say that you've followed the guidance in that code of practice, it goes a long way to you saying you've complied with your obligations in this space.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dickson. We've had another one come through from a viewer who is a small business. So they're a little bit cost conscious, naturally. They say they like the idea of issuing and signing off training in a portal. Is there a cost-effective version of this approach that you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in terms of training, again, remembering that there's different type of training that you can be providing. So there's the more kind of on-the-job training, the more training on how to perform a particular task. And that might be something even as a small business that you are already providing, whether formally or informally. And so if that is being done, particularly in a formal way, then firstly, just see if you can get that recorded. Get a good register and record of training that's being provided. That way you can always look back at it and see what training has already been given and maybe what other training you need to provide as well. Absolutely, there are external providers who give specific training on particular issues, on how to use particular equipment or machinery safely, as well as training on the non-physical risk to health and safety. So, for example, LegalVision, as part of our membership, we've got a specific work health and safety advisory service that our members can get access to, sign up for. As part of that, we actually provide regular training to officers and to workers. And so I think it's kind of a cost-effective way to be able to access that training and provide it. I'm not sure if there are free versions of training. Of course, there might be free training available, resources that you could find online. Obviously, can't guarantee how the quality of those types of training and resources. But again, from a resource perspective, I always recommend starting with Safe Work Australia or Safe Work in the particular state or territory that you're in, because they provide a lot of really helpful tools and resources as well.
Great, yeah. We've had another one come through. How often should regular training and WHS policy reviews be completed with our employees, just as a general rule of thumb?
Yeah, so I think with this question, training and policy reviews. So I think in terms of being completed with employees, you absolutely want that to be happening at the commencement of employment. So it's not uncommon to provide employees with your employee handbook or a policy pack at the beginning as part of their induction, and you want them to read and confirm that they will comply with them, that they understand them as well. In terms of how regularly you want to do it after that, I'd say sometimes it depends on if something occurs. So if you're noticing a particular issue in the workplace, that might trigger you to actually remind them of the policy. And it's actually really important that you're enforcing it as well. So for example, if you notice that there is quite a lot of bullying happening in your workplace and you've got a policy around this, which they've signed on day one, well, you actually want to make sure as part of your implementation process is that you're calling them out when you see it. You're not just letting it go. And again, this is the sort of thing that might impact, well, do you need to reinforce anything, remind them of anything, train them on that issue as well. But in terms of the regularity of it, I think at least once a year is a good starting point there to refresh and remind workers of their kind of behavior that's acceptable and not acceptable, and yeah, be training them on that as well. So again, it is context dependent as well, in that sometimes you need to organize more spontaneous training because you've noticed a common issue arising. And so, yeah, this is all part of your monitoring and continual improvement as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So we've had another one come through from a labour hire company. So WHS policies will be from their clients, and they're just not sure whether they should have the WHS policy in place as well, given obviously their workers are actually going to be physically performing work on client sites.
Yeah, really good question, and a common one that we receive. So if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, or near the beginning, Ellie addressed some key duty holders under WHS laws, the PCBU or the business being one of them. It's just important to remember that there are multiple duty holders under the law. And so as a labour hire company, you have duties towards your workers, but your client will also have duties towards your worker. And we come back to that principle and requirement to take reasonable steps. And so you could still have your own WHS policy, but that policy might say, as part of working with us or being employed with us, we are going to send you to our client sites to work for them, to place you with them, and you must comply with their workplace health and safety policies and procedures that they provide to you. So you could absolutely still have a policy which addresses your obligations, any consultation that you might do, but specifically tailor it to say that your employees must comply with your clients' work health and safety policies. That's absolutely a reasonable step that you can be taking. Another idea here would be, so that's between you and your workers, between you and your clients as well. So say in your labour hire agreement, any terms and conditions, a reasonable step you can be taking is include in those contracts and terms and conditions that your client must provide a safe workplace, that maybe they need to provide a safety induction when your employees or workers attend their site for the first time. So that way, we're kind of acknowledging you've got limited control over your client's premises, but you're still taking steps, putting actual requirements under a contract on your clients as well. So the upshot here is you still have obligations as a labour hire company, but it's just to do what's reasonably practicable. And I've hopefully given you a couple of ideas that you can implement, but there are others you can consider as well, such as consulting with your client to see how a safe workplace can be provided. So just looking at the time, and I've seen that there are a few more questions as well. Really sorry if we haven't had a chance to get to your questions. I know there was quite a lot of content that we got through, a lot of practical tips that we provided. So hopefully it's been helpful. If your question has been unanswered, feel free to, as part of the next step of completing that survey, just leave your details with us. And yeah, we can reach out to you and see what further assistance that we can provide to your business. So we are going to wrap up for now. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. Hope it's been useful. And yeah, thank you for taking safety seriously, spending time thinking about it and how to implement it for your business and promoting a safety first culture. So again, we really value your feedback. So if you could please kindly complete the 30-second survey at the end of the webinar, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks again and have a great day.